A man was a member of what they call a list group, something like a chat room, but a closed user group, where people used to discuss topics. And he says, as usual, that happens in these chat rooms. First of all, the topics can be long. They can get distracted. And he says on one day they got distracted and the sidetracked topic went on for a long time, and people were starting to get irritated because people weren't agreeing with each other's views. And then also some were angry because this off-topic discussion went on for so long. And then there was another lot that came in and said, but the topic wasn't encouraging enough. And this kind of hit it for the guy. He says, he had a look at this. He says, these people are part of the group that are chatting, but they're saying the topic and the discussion is not encouraging enough, but they're very part of the group that's being discouraging. He says it struck him then again how often people complain about the things in others which they do themselves. In fact, I once saw a statement that says, we often complain the most about things in others that we detest in ourselves. And you know, that's not something new. If you go back into Romans chapter 2, we find that even in Paul's day, the Romans were complaining about the sin in the Gentiles, but they were doing the same things themselves. Romans 2 verse 1, therefore you have no excuse, every one of you who judges, for when you pass judgment on another person, you condemn yourself, since you, the judge, practice the very same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who act like this is based on truth. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on those who practice these things and then do them yourself, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Paul wasn't saying that what the Gentiles were doing was right. He was also saying that, yes, the judgment of the Gentiles was accurate, but the problem with the Romans was they were doing the same thing. The Jews were not wrong in condemning the sins of the Gentiles, but they were wrong in thinking that they weren't part of the same problem. Romans 2 verse 17, Paul carries on writing and says, now if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast about God, and you know His will and approve of what is best, because you have been instructed in the law, and if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of ignorant people and a teacher of infants, because you have the full content of knowledge and truth in the law, as you teach others, do you fail to teach yourself? As you preach against stealing, do you steal? As you forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? As you abhor idols, do you rob temples? As you boast about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is being blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. How often is it that people complain of something in others they do themselves? How many of you remember the name Jimmy Swaggart? I think I might have used this illustration a little while ago. His claim to fame was that he defrocked another preacher because of adultery. Can you remember what Jimmy Swaggart's claim to fame was after that? Adultery. You see, if adultery is wrong for somebody else, it's wrong for us. If stealing's wrong for somebody else, it's wrong for us. But very often we want to point out the sin of somebody else and forget about our own. Today, are things very much better or not? How often have you heard somebody say a congregation is not friendly? They don't have enough love. They're not hospitable enough. And how often isn't it one of the members in that congregation making that statement? By their own admission, they are condemning themselves because they are part of the very group they are condemning. You see, very often we want to be part of God's kingdom, but we still want to be separate from the kingdom. We want to be treated differently, but everybody else must fall under the law of God. Jesus warned about this in Matthew chapter 7. Verse 1, he says, "Stop judging so that you won't be judged. Because the way that you judge others will be, the way you judge others will be the way that you will be judged. And you will be evaluated by the standard with which you evaluate others." That's kind of scary, isn't it? I know Derek's used the phrase sometimes we want grace for ourselves and justice for others. But that's not how God works. If you want justice for others, He's going to make sure that you get justice as well. But if you're willing to extend grace to others, well, maybe it'll be slightly different. Jesus goes on in that passage to say, why do you try to take the speck out of your brother's eye, but you've got a log in your own eye? My dad always used to illustrate this, and he says, can you imagine this big log sticking out of your eye? And I always thought the log is kind of small for a log, but can you imagine this? And you trying to get that splinter out your brother's eye. How do you see to do it? How do you even get close to him to do it if this log is between you? But isn't that sometimes what we want to do? We all know the story of David. David tried to do that, take the log out of somebody's eye while he had, a splinter out of someone's eye while he had a log in his own. We know the story of Bathsheba, what David did and how he was forgiven and how his son died, and then you had Solomon afterwards. But in between that story, there's a section where Nathan comes to David. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1, "So the Lord sent Nathan to David. Nathan approached David and said, 'There are two men in the city. One is rich and one is poor. The rich man has many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It used to share his food and drink from his own cup. He even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him.' A traveler arrived to visit the rich man because he was unwilling to take an animal from one of his own flocks or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to visit him. He took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to visit him. David flew into a rage at the man and told Nathan, 'As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die.'" Let's have a look at a couple of voices after that. "He will restore the lamb 4 times its value because he did this thing and because he did it without compassion." Can you imagine David, he's king, standing up telling Nathan this? This is what's going to happen. Nathan turns around and says, Nathan replied to David, "You are the man." Oh, jeepers, if you want to take the wind out of somebody's sail, point out something like that to them. He says to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. I anointed the king, and you became king over Israel. Anointed you king, sorry. I delivered you from Saul's control. I gave you your former master's household. I placed your former master's wives right in your arms. I gave you Israel and Judah. And if this had been too little, I would have added much more than that to you. Why did you despise what the Lord has promised by doing that which is detestable in his sight? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with a battle sword. You took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonite army." How much did David have in comparison to Uriah? You see, David, in his anger, demonstrated that he understood what was right and what was wrong in the situation. And in doing so, he condemned himself. Another way that people condemn themselves, we look and we see the Jews in Jesus' day, they used to build memorial to the old prophets. You see, in doing so, they showed that they believed that the old prophets were correct, they were from God, and they were teaching what was correct. Yet the same prophets were killed by their ancestors. In Matthew 23, verse 29, Jesus says, "How terrible it will be for you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. Then you say, if we had been living in the days of our ancestors, we would have had no part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Therefore," Jesus says, "you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets." We don't kind of think of it that way, do we? If we had been there with our ancestors, oh, it was your ancestors that murdered the prophets? Goes on in verse 34. He says to them, "That is why I'm sending you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will whip in your synagogues and persecute from town to town. As a result, you will be held accountable for all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar." You see, they demonstrated that they knew what was right and what was wrong with the old prophets. But what did they do? They did exactly the same thing that they said they would have fought against if they had been there. They didn't stand up and save John the Baptist. They opposed the teachings of Jesus, who was the Son of God, who taught them out of their own law, out of their own books. They showed that they were no different to the ancestors. All talk, no action. Soon they would kill the Son of God and persecute God's people, the very people who honored the prophets of old. There's another way that people judge and don't do what they're supposed to. We know the parable of the talents. What happened with the talent with the one man? Buried it in the ground. And when the rich man came back, the man said, "I knew you were a hard man, so I buried it so it wouldn't get lost, so I could give back to you what is yours." In Luke 19, verse 22, the king told him, "I will judge you by your own words, you evil servant. You knew, did you, that I was a hard man, and that I withdraw what I didn't deposit and harvest what I didn't plant? Then why didn't you put my money in the bank? When I returned, I could have collected it with interest." You see, this man knew what the rich man required of him, just like we know what God requires of us. But sometimes, like this man with the one talent, we know what we have to do, we just don't do it. We ignore the Word of God. And that condemns us as well, because just knowing the Word of God and not reacting on it, you see, it's not always doing something that's wrong, but failing to do what is right can also be wrong. There's another thing that ensnares people and traps them and condemns them, and that's the tongue. In James, we know that the tongue is hard to control. If you've ever seen a dog with his head out of the window in a moving car, he doesn't control that tongue. But he's got more control over his tongue than a lot of human beings. Therefore, it's not surprising where evil people actually condemn themselves just by what they say. What Charles read tonight, we read about where David writes about the tongue that damages people, or tries to. In 64 verse 3 of Psalms, he says, who sharpen their tongues like swords and aim their bitter words like arrows. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody that's been killed with a sword or shot with an arrow. It's not the neat little hole that Hollywood predicts. It's bloody. It's gory. If you want to get an idea of what maybe a sword and fighting with a sword is like, go read maybe one of Wilbur Smith's books where he describes a battle of where the impies go and they wet their swords in their enemy's blood. It's very graphic, and I'm not going to go into it. It's much too graphic for you. But when the words that David is talking about here, they're like swords, they're like arrows. You see, the wounds in those days, there wasn't a doctor to sit there and stitch it up. They didn't have the medical know-how to pull the arrow out and save the person's internal organs. Once they started wounding, they started killing. In verse 8, I know Charles read a version, my version said, they tripped over their own tongues, and everyone who was watching ran away. You see, the verse before that says, but God shot an arrow at them, and they were wounded immediately. You see, here again, we can use our tongue to condemn ourselves by doing nothing more than talking about things that we shouldn't. Another way we condemn ourselves is when our actions are not associated with what we preach and believe. In Psalms 50 verse 16, as for the wicked, God says, how dare you recite my statutes or speak about my covenant with your lips? You hate instruction and toss my words behind you. When you see a thief, you befriend him, and you keep company with adulterers. You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue devises deceit. You sit and speak against your brother. You slander your own mother's son. These things you did, and I kept silent, because you assumed that I was like you. But now I'm going to rebuke you, and I will set forth my case before your very own eyes. You see, here God says, how dare you talk about my statutes and my law, and you do the very things against the law that I've spoken about. There's also those who call on the Lord. They're not obedient. How often don't you see people, when they are in trouble, that's when they call to God. But when they're not in trouble, God gets forgotten. In Luke 6 and verse 46, why do you keep calling me Lord, Lord, but don't do what I tell you? He goes on after that to describe the house on the rock, the house on the sand, and how the one fell and the one stood, because the one that was built on rock was like those who heard Christ's word and listened to them and obeyed them. The other one is people who hear and they ignore it. That's why in Titus we find that one who willingly separates himself from the teaching of Christ is self-condemned. Titus 3 verse 10 and 11, have nothing to do with a divisive person after you have warned him once or twice. How often don't we carry on and carry on warning? Here Titus says once or twice. If the man is divisive, don't have anything to do with him. Ladies, you might be let off the hook for today, but today only. For you know that a person like this is corrupt and keeps on sinning, being self-condemned. Not my words, God's words. Was a young man near the end of his college education. Him and his brother, they visited a congregation that wasn't one where they normally worshipped. In fact, I think it was in another state or another county, whatever you want to call it. And when they got there, they could see people were kind of distraught and very much withdrawn, and nobody came up to them and greeted them, even though they were visitors. So this man's brother looked at him, he says, "We need to do something." The guy says, "Yeah, you're right." So they went up and greeted the people as though they were from the local congregation, and the people in the local congregation were the visitors. They said within a few minutes, everyone was talking to each other, greeting them, and they actually found a family there that were close friends of a family in their home congregation. And after Bible study, they went up to their house for refreshments and spent the evening with them. The young man says, we could have turned around, walked out of there and said, "Jeepers, but this is an unfriendly congregation." But he says, then they would have condemned themselves because they would have done exactly the same thing as the other people in that congregation were doing. Here's something maybe to think about when it comes to congregations. Belleville is not separate from Central. It's not separate from Riverview or Thicket Road or Bokmakiri or Atlantis. We are all part of God's church. So if we want to condemn another congregation as being unfriendly, we actually condemn ourselves because we are part of the same body of Jesus Christ. See, the responsibility for improvement falls on my shoulders when I recognize the problem. Sometimes we don't always recognize the problem immediately, but it's up to me when I see the problem to do something about it. Sometimes we say, well, we've got to be content. Paul said, I'm content in all things, wherever I find myself. But what is content really? The way I've put it down is, I accept what I have and what I have done, but I continue to still do what needs to be done. Whereas if I'm complacent, I don't care, someone else can do it, I don't really interested as to whether it's going to be done or not, I'm just going to sit back and twiddle my thumbs. You see, there's a difference between being content and being complacent. To complain and do nothing is to condemn myself. If I want to change the world, I first have to change my view of the world. Instead of focusing on the sin, I need to focus on the sinner. Romans 3:23, we know, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Instead of looking at what sins people have committed, focus on the sinner and the soul that Christ wants for himself. If I want to change and alter the world, I change myself first. Because once I've changed myself, I've already altered the world.